Welcome to the Generation Hustle podcast, a show that explores the world of business, entrepreneurship, and culture, all centered around the millennial. I'm your co-host Sherison alongside my good friend Amin, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Scott Stirrett, founder and CEO of Venture for Canada, or VFC. VFC is a non-profit organization with a mission to foster the entrepreneurial mindset and skills of young Canadians. The organization envisions a Canada where the youth can equitably realize their potential to build the most prosperous place in the world. VFC achieves this through an internship program for post-secondary students and a fellowship program for graduates that help train the necessary skills and knowledge to succeed in the entrepreneurial ecosystem with other like-minded peers. Through 7 years, VFC has grown from an idea to a national charity with 20 staff members, a multi-million-dollar budget, and more than 5,000 community members and alumni. We talked to Scott about how he brought this idea to life, what the programs have to offer, and what the education system today fails to prepare young graduates for in the business world. So if you're looking to jumpstart your next big idea, have a listen and see if Venture for Canada can help you along the way. So we wanted to start off with your story with Venture for Canada, obviously, and kind of get that background in there. So one of the things that when we were looking at your story that we come across a lot is that a lot of like common complaints with entrepreneurs is that there's no school system, there's no teachable programs for entrepreneurship. It's kind of something that you just get your hands in and dirty. So we wanted to understand your story and how you were inspired to build Venture for Canada. So can you walk us through how you came up with the idea for that and what drove you towards this approach for curating entrepreneurship into like a learnable program?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I first had the idea for founding Venture for Canada when I was a university student. So I went to University of Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and I saw a program called Venture for America and thought to myself, oh, I'd love to apply to this program. I couldn't because I'm not a US citizen.
Mm-hmm.
But I looked kind of enviously as I had different friends who did the program. And for additional background, while I was a university student, I interned at various kind of startup not-for-profits, and I played a role launching a student advocacy organization alongside some other students. And it was through that experience that I really realized that what I like the most is really social entrepreneurship and creating something from nothing. And at the same time, I found that when I was graduating from university, it was very challenging to find a job in a startup right out of school.
Right.
So even though I had done all these entrepreneurial things, I ended up applying to Goldman Sachs for an internship, got the internship, and I then ended up getting a full-time offer and went to go work at Goldman Sachs full-time after I graduated. And I think one of the things that kind of existed for me was this, I was about to start working at Goldman Sachs in New York City, even though I didn't really want to, and all my passion was in social entrepreneurship and really launching new things.
Right.
And for me, one of the things that I really sort of saw was I thought to myself, why isn't there Venture for Canada? Like I would love a program like this to exist. So I remember Googling, does a Venture for Canada exist? It didn't. And then 7 years later, this is in the journey of building Venture for Canada over this period of time. So really what motivated me to found Venture for Canada was to address a problem I saw firsthand as a recent graduate, which is that it's very challenging for young people to gain work experience in startups. And more fundamentally, that one of the best ways to develop entrepreneurial skills and learn how to become an entrepreneur is through working in a startup.
Right.
So I think entrepreneurship can very much be a skill, or being entrepreneurial is a skill that you develop over time. And you do that through building, through learning, through doing. And that's how you enhance your entrepreneurial skills. Certainly does one's DNA probably have some impact on it? Yes. But I do think that it's something through practice and through hard work that somebody can significantly refine their entrepreneurial capabilities.
For sure. Yeah. So on that note, like when you're talking about refining those skills and things like that, what are some of those things that you honed in on? Obviously, placing students or people a part of the program into an internship at a startup will allow them to kind of pick those skills up. But from a theory standpoint, like what did you focus on in terms of things that should be instilled in these students?
It's a great question. So I think the most important entrepreneurial skills are ones that are one could label as human skills. So uh, the definition, my favorite definition of entrepreneurship is one the European Union uses, and they define an entrepreneur kind of uh, being entrepreneurial as acting upon opportunities to create value for others, and that value can be economic, social, environmental, etc.
Right.
So to me, some of the specific entrepreneurial skills that are most important are first off, I think the ability to have self-efficacy. So in essence, to view that you have the potential to build something and to be successful. Like if you don't have a sense of self-belief or belief in your own ability to do things, it's like that's a baseline that's super important.
Right.
Um, I'd say a second thing that's super important is to have a natural curiosity about the world. So be, I think, a person who likes learning about new things and uh, um, yeah, is just naturally curious. I'd say a third skill that I think is super important is communications, the ability to speak persuasively, to write persuasively, to be able to work well with others. The fourth point that I'd say is I think that the ability to have grit and to overcome obstacles
Right.
and challenges, and actually to become stronger after facing challenges. Post-traumatic growth, as some people kind of write about, I think is something that's super important. And there's many other ones, but I'd say the final one that I'll talk about is I think the ability, and this is kind of a problem, but the ability to mobilize resources. Like if you're an entrepreneurial person, if you're adding value in this world, ultimately to build anything, you need to be somebody who can mobilize resources, and that's partly communications, but it's also a lot of strategy, right? Like how do you get the money to be able to build it? How do you get the people? How do you figure out what you need in order to achieve the different objectives? So there's many different entrepreneurial competencies, but I think that those are some of the ones I think are the most important.
For sure. Yeah, that's I like that a lot. Those are very concrete and very foundational to any entrepreneur trying to break out onto the scene. So I think instilling those early on would be something it's hard in a school environment because we're not technically taught those things. So what was like the feedback that you started getting once you started on this journey? Like when you were curating the program and setting up the company and things like that, like what was the feedback that you were receiving when you were introducing this concept?
When I first started doing Venture for Canada, and this would have been in the fall of 2013,
Right.
I initially, like many entrepreneurs, did customer discovery. So I interviewed around 20 different students to see if they would want to apply to something like the Venture for Canada Fellowship Program. And then I interviewed around 20 uh, companies to see if they would want to hire Venture Canada fellows. And the initial feedback I received was extremely positive. And I think that it's really important to solicit that feedback
Right.
in order to get an idea of whether something's kind of needed. What's interesting is the first year when I was working on Venture for Canada, I met with hundreds of different people, and some of them were incredibly senior people in Canadian society who I just cold emailed.
Right.
I can think of one person who I met with who was the former clerk of the Privy Council of Canada. So basically the former most senior, at the time he was not the clerk, but he was the former clerk,
Right.
and then a senior bank executive.
Okay.
And I met with him to just describe Venture for Canada. And this would have been in summer 2014. And this person basically told me, that Venture Canada was a bad idea, that, it didn't make sense. I met with another guy, uh, you know, multi billionaire in his 70s in Ottawa, who is a successful tech entrepreneur by background. And all person also basically told me Venture for Canada was a bad idea. Uh, and I think the reason I mention this is that there were many people who were really helpful, and there were many people who, I think encouraged me in a positive way. However, when you're an entrepreneur, and especially the first few years of doing things, you will be told by a lot of people, including by a lot of people who are very powerful and very successful, that what you're doing is dumb and isn't going to be successful. Now you have to filter the feed. The thing with both feedback, I think a lot of times there's a kind of a common misconception that you should always accept all feedback that's given to you.
Right.
I don't believe that. I think we ultimately live in a world where we're bombarded by feedback.
Right.
And you have to filter what feedback you agree with and is logical and what feedback isn't. And what's interesting is in that first year of Venture for Canada, and my final kind of comment is that if you really believe in something and you're really confident in your idea, you can't be afraid, and you can't be demotivated by all of the naysayers, including if those naysayers are very prominent. And you just kind of have to ignore them and push on. And in some ways, maybe not the healthiest, but sometimes that skepticism by those people can actually fuel your energy and your passion to be successful.
For sure. Yeah. And to go back to the human skills that you touched on, like, I think that's one of those that entrepreneurs need to have instilled in them, like that idea that you're going to get a lot of no's and you just have to keep pushing through that. So the Venture for Canada is an interesting way for young entrepreneurs to learn those skills. But how did you learn that? Because obviously you were trying to create this program and people are telling you, hey, this sucks, but you kind of went through with it and it's been successful now. So how did you deal with that? Where did that kind of those traits for you come from?
So I think a few things is that the logic backed up the idea. Like the customers, the students, and the companies gave me the positive feedback that I knew the idea would work. So the people who were the most important, they gave me the confidence to say, okay, this is something to try. If someone is 70 years old and very removed from the problem that I'm solving, frankly, their advice doesn't really matter that much. Right? I'll take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
So I think in terms of your question of what kind of gave me the endurance or the kind of self-confidence, I think some I have to credit to my parents, that I think that they gave me a healthy dose of self-confidence. I think, I would honestly say a lot goes on, in my parents. Probably some of it is nurture, some of it is just probably in my DNA. But I think ultimately it's just one of the things that's really, I go back to is I think that there's a line between cockiness and confidence. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's really important is to be able to picture yourself as a successful, be able to picture yourself as the person you want to be.
Right.
And if you can't picture yourself as that person, you're never going to be that person. Like if you don't believe in yourself, no one else is going to believe in you. There are challenges everywhere in life. And what you can control, you can't control a lot of things, but you can control your ability and your ability to have a positive view of your own self.
That's a great point. And Amin and I have talked about this a lot. Like, we're both very visual learners. And so we prefer to like take in information visually, but at the same time, like it took me a while to understand that like maybe I should start visualizing my success as well. So like I'm actively kind of working towards that. So that's a really good point. I like that a lot. So what I wanted to kind of touch on there was one of the things that we found going through Venture for Canada, and kind of the things that you provide, was the fellowship training camp. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, what that entails, and what kind of the participants can expect from that?
So the fellow training camp is definitely the cornerstone of the Venture Canada Fellow experience. Pre-COVID, it was an in-person event that we would do that takes place around a month that we would host in Kingston, Ontario at the Smith School of Business.
Right.
And the training camp is really intended to bridge the participants in the Venture Canada Fellowship Program, aka the fellows, to go from attending post-secondary to working in startups.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it does that through a few different ways. The first is through kind of in-classroom training, where there's a focus on developing some of those entrepreneurial competencies, but there's also an increased awareness of what are some of the different career paths that exist within startups, and what are the different options that people can pursue if they want to go work in startups. Another focus is actually getting the different fellows working together in teams on different kind of challenges, because I think that project-based learning is incredibly effective, and it's also particularly effective for entrepreneurial people who are action-oriented.
Right.
That action, or entrepreneurial people don't learn the best often by reading; they learn by doing. The last point of the fellow training camp is a huge component of it is the building of the fellow community. That having a positive network, or having a supportive network of peers who share similar values, who are also entrepreneurial, can really be life-changing in terms of accelerating someone's potential. And it does that through a few different ways. One is, there's a great Jim Rohn quote that I was first told when I was in my final year of university, where he talks about, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Mm-hmm.
And the great thing about kind of fellowship type programs that are highly selective, or any kind of highly selective program, is they push you to be a better version of yourself.
Right.
And I think that that's probably what the Venture for Canada does. Because all the fellows would live in dorms together, and they build a strong sense of community. And we try to foster that even on our virtual fellow training camps through Zoom, but I think it is harder. The goal is that by bringing all these bright, high potential people for a month living together in dorms, that it builds this sense of community and network that is can be super helpful for somebody later in their career, both in the sense of pushing people to be better versions of themselves, but I also think in terms of access to a whole network of people who you can go to for intros, for advice, for as employees, as co-founders, all these different kinds of things. So yeah, that's a kind of overview of fellow training camp.
For sure. Yeah. And that community aspect makes it very easy and more likable to kind of go on that journey and of learning something new, especially like entrepreneurship. And you touched on it already. You mentioned, obviously, we've had disruptions with COVID. How has that affected you right now, just with the situation, with everything going on?
We've done a pretty good job of pivoting to COVID. I think partly our team is only around 20 people, like our staff.
Right.
And we've relatively easily been able to make the transition to working remotely, partly because we have staff in St. John's, Halifax, Toronto, so at Calgary, so we're kind of naturally spread out anyway.
Yeah.
With regards to our programs, we've done a quite good job on our internship program. We'll have placed way more people this year than we ever have in the past, almost 3 times this year the number that we did the previous year.
Right.
And in our fellowship program, it's been a little bit more challenging to find the fellows employment, but I think we're on track to achieve similar objectives to what we did in 2019. So overall, I think we've done a pretty good job. It has been a huge shift. It feels like it's been 2020 has been like 2 years, not 9 months. But yeah, I've been really happy with what I think the team's accomplished, and I actually think Venture for Canada has emerged stronger and more resilient through this crisis than we were, which is, I think, Nassim Taleb, there has a great book called, or I'm not sure what the book's called, but he writes about anti-fragility, which is in essence, to be fragile is, I have a glass, I throw it on the ground, it breaks. To be anti-fragile is, I have a glass, I throw it on the ground, and the glass actually becomes stronger. And it's interesting. In English, there's not really a good word for it other than anti-fragility. But I think that in the case of Venture for Canada, we've demonstrated to some extent anti-fragility. Like, the strongest organizations are ones that actually, crises can make them more resilient and stronger. While we've had ups and downs, I think that there are aspects that we've demonstrated of anti-fragility through all of this.
For sure. Yeah. And that's amazing. You guys had 3 times the enrollment this year. So I think the virtual aspect of it will help a lot with that as well. So on that kind of like line of thinking as well, we wanted to kind of pivot into the understanding behind the program. So obviously you touched on the fact that, this helps the entrepreneurs, the young entrepreneurs, kind of fill the gap in understanding and education when they're entering the industry. So I was looking at some stats while I was working on this, and this has actually came up as part of some of your interviews as well. Like, you've quoted a McKinsey report that actually said about 83% of educators feel youth are prepared for work, while only 34% of employers and 44% of those actual youth agree with that. Like, they don't actually, half that number actually don't even feel ready. So why do you think this gap exists? And this kind of feeds into that, into the institutions of education right now, which are kind of under wraps because of COVID. So like, why do you think that gap exists? And how do we kind of reduce this gap moving forward? Like, is it a matter of adjusting the institutions, or is it a matter of more private companies kind of coming up to fill that gap?
Yeah, I think I think that there's definitely a lot of companies that are I think coming to address the gap of helping students. Actually, sorry, can you repeat the question again? I kind of lost my train of thought.
For sure, yeah. So I was working off one of the stats from a McKinsey report that mentioned that 83% of educators feel that youth are prepared for work, whereas when you ask those youth, only like 40% of them actually feel ready. So there's a gap that exists. So what I wanted to know from you is, why do you think that gap exists? And also what we can do to kind of mitigate that gap moving forward.
Cool, sounds good. This is what happens sometimes after a Friday before. I was a little ambitious in scheduling it right before Thanksgiving, but no, that was a good. Thank you for repeating the question.
Don't even worry.
So I think the gap, the skills gap between post-secondary institutions and between the skills that the young people have and the skills that employers need, I think it exists for a couple of reasons. I think one is that the skills that people in general need to thrive in this current economy are changing at a faster rate than they ever have before. I was just actually reading a World Economic Forum study this morning from 2018.
Right.
And it talks about, the amount of skills that basically within 5 years, that's, a very high percentage of the workforce within 5 years, that the majority of the skills they used on a daily basis are become obsolete.
Right.
So it's challenging for educational environments to keep up with that level of, I think, of change and skills that are required. So I'd say that's a first point. I'd say a second point is that increasingly the skills that are most important are the human skills, and in essence, really entrepreneurial skills. The ability to work well with other people, the ability to communicate, the ability to self-regulate emotions, all of these different kinds of things.
Right.
And while implicitly our educational institutions teach those things, a lot of the focus, I think sometimes the mindset of many people is that we're still in an economy from the 1980s, where it was more about performing routine tasks or automating things over, the reality is that economy is slowly dying.
Right.
And the kind of skills that are most important today than they ever were the human skills. And unfortunately, that there's a gap that exists where a lot of those human skills aren't being developed in people when they're younger. So to answer your question about why this sort of gap exists, is that hard skills are important, but they're the hard skills that are needed are being cycled out faster and faster. So if someone develops a hard skill, it becomes irrelevant. And then the human skills, which are continually important, are not ones that are being developed as much within our existing educational system. With regards to the second part of your question, which is how can those be developed more, which I think the $1 trillion question. So I think it starts at a very early childhood education, right? To throughout the education system. So one thing to think about is, there's a great book called The Intentional University by Ben. Anyway, I forgot his last name, but basically it's about Minerva University, which is trying to be like the first like startup university, and it's not like a sketchy kind of online university. It's a their CEO is, or their chair is like Larry Summers, who's the former president of Harvard. It's like a very like legit institution.
Right.
But in the book he talks about, for your instance, with university classes, right? You can take a university course on something, and let's say I took a class in university, and I love this course, but it was New Zealand Film Studies, and I took it in my last semester in university, and it was fun to take, but it wasn't necessarily specifically aligned in any way with what I did kind of full time. What the author of The Intentional University talks about is, what if, for instance, you took, logical thinking, for instance. It's important in our economy. Rather than taking, like, let's say, an English class or something, you took a logical thinking course, right? You took a course on emotional intelligence. You took a course on, like, imagine a school system that's more where the courses aren't necessarily they're more based around developing essential competencies that you actually need in the real world. Communications, like you just had a class on communicating with people. Mental health. What if everybody just had a mental health class that they took?
Yep.
What about even like self-efficacy, like building that in as a competency, as like a course. So I think that there's a challenge around how to align the education system, including in particular at the K-12 level, with developing more of those human skills that are essential for people. So that's on the human skill level. I'd say second is that one of the best ways you can develop human skills is just through applied learning. So how do we provide more co-ops, more internships, more ability to do project-based learning at a younger age, including in high school, and again, make school more interactive, but also, have one of the things that I think Venture for Canada contributes to is have every student in Canada complete an internship before they graduate.
Right.
Build more, because it's through that applied learning that people develop those human skills. It's not just through the education system, but I think one has to look at the education system. So that's point 2, is more applied learning. I think point 3 is looking at more tailored training and education programs that are linked to developing specific skills for specific sectors with regards to the technical skills. So looking at things like on a high level, like coding boot camps, right? But there's many other kinds of like programs that people can do for 3 months where they develop the basic skills that are needed in order to be able to thrive in a specific kind of role. And making sure, colleges in Canada do a good job on this, is that having industry advisory councils where the representatives from industry, the employers who actually be hiring the graduates, are giving direct feedback on the curriculum, so that the curriculum is always being up to date and the hard skills that are being developed are actually what the employers need, like today. They're not what they needed 5 years ago.
For sure.
So to recap, 3 things would be how to integrate human skills more into the curricula of all the education institutions in Canada, more applied learning, and more hard skills training that employers actually provide feedback on, so it is tailored directly to the needs of employers today.
Right. I think that's a perfect segue, because you've obviously spoken on kind of the intangibles and tangibles you need as a young entrepreneur, but we know that as a young entrepreneur, there's many challenges that come about, right? So let's kind of pivot into the actual business model for Venture for Canada. So you guys are a nonprofit, and versus a traditional for-profit, the model differs. So can you describe what it's like to run an actual nonprofit organization and the type of challenges you face as an organization versus a traditional for-profit?
It's a fantastic question. So the way Venture for Canada's revenue comes, I'll break down the high level components of Venture for Canada's revenue. Venture for Canada receives revenue from government grants and contributions. Venture for Canada receives income from corporate donors and sponsors, including RBC Foundation, TD Bank, and others. Venture for Canada receives funding from family foundations and individuals as donations. Venture for Canada receives fee income from participants and employers for the fellowship program. And those are the 4 major kind of components of funding that Venture for Canada receives. Not-for-profit, there's a great Stanford Social Innovation Review article written over 10 years ago, where they talk about funding models versus business models. And in the article, the author writes that the difference that a not-for-profit doesn't have a business model. It has a funding model. Because a business model is about, if you're a for-profit business and you're selling, if you're a restaurant, right, and you're a restaurant selling sandwiches, your customers are the people who give you money that then keeps your business operating. And you're also providing a service. You're providing those sandwiches to those people who give you money. For most not-for-profits, not all, but the revenue that you receive, or the income that you receive, is not from necessarily the people you're directly serving.
Right.
So as a result, that the Stanford Social Innovation Review article talks about that not-for-profits have, in essence, funding models, because there's fundamentally different than a business model of a for-profit. So in the case of Venture for Canada, our funding model is predominantly, government grants, but then also some other aspects that I guess what Stanford Social Innovation Review would describe as beneficiary kind of model. I think some of the challenges of running a not-for-profit. So one is that it is more complicated. There are for-profit companies at different sizes have diverse stakeholders, and particularly at a large level.
Right.
But if you take a not-for-profit that is $2 million or $3 million a year in revenue versus a business that has $2 to $3 million of revenue, the diversity of the stakeholders of that not-for-profit are much more significant. You have board members, you have your donors, you have the people you serve, you have the staff, you have all of these different groups. And a real challenge in a not-for-profit is, in essence, like these different constituency groups can sometimes have very different perceptions of different problems, of different strategies of the organization, of how the organization operates. And as a leader of a not-for-profit, it's how to reconcile all these different kind of groups together in a way that makes the organization work and makes sure that the organization is going in the right direction.
Right.
So So to answer your question about what the challenges of a not-for-profit versus a for-profit, it is the stakeholder question. And it's also a question that in many instances, not-for-profits receive money from a different group than who they're actually serving, which creates a complex alignment of incentives, right? And it makes sure, if you're a for-profit and you're selling sandwiches and people don't like your product, then they're just not going to buy your sandwiches, and then things go. In not-for-profits, it can be tougher because the funding isn't, the funding is not necessarily linked directly to what the satisfaction is in all instances of the participants. And a challenge for not-for-profits also is to make sure that you're always top of mind of a focus on the participants, on benefiting, the people you're serving are the top priority, not necessarily the people who are giving you money. But it's easy to put the people who give money as the top of the pyramid. I think that's actually a mistake that a lot of not-for-profits make and shouldn't do.
I mean, no, that's a great point there. So you've obviously serviced a lot of alumni throughout the program through the 7 years of inception. So can you maybe name a few of individuals that you personally know that have maybe gone on to build something great for the Canadian tech ecosystem?
Absolutely. So one is a 2016 Venture for Canada fellow named Chris Grouchy. He founded a Y Combinator backed startup called Convictional. I think that they now have like 10 or 15 employees. And I think Chris is a phenomenal, entrepreneur, and graduated from the program, or entered into the program just over 4 years ago. He'd probably be 26 now. He graduated from Queen's in 2016 as well. Another Venture for Canada fellow to highlight is Misha Saad. Misha co-founded a successful yoga apparel business.
Okay.
That is kind of like a competitor to Lululemon. That's a multi-million-dollar company selling yoga apparel. Very successful. It's called Namaesthetics. It's a really good name.
Great name.
I agree. It's a fantastic name. And really has built it into a really successful company. So I'd say Misha is one person I would definitely highlight. I think as doing great things. Another person I would highlight is Sam Daviau, who's the VP of Operations at Stafflow, one of the senior leaders of like around a 60-person startup in Toronto. He's also the chair of our alumni council and gives back a lot to Venture for Canada. So our alumni. The reason I particularly mentioned Sam at the end is that the alumni pursue very different. Some of them are executives in startups and part of building things over time.
Right.
Others are people who go play a role building companies. And another person to mention is actually one of our fellows. Alumni is the co-founder of Clearbank, which many people know is a very successful international company. So we have tons of. I could go on. The VP of Sales of Ada Support.
No way.
Canada fellow alumni.
Wow.
Head of Revenue Operations at Grammarly, Venture for Canada fellow alumni. One of our fellow alumni was just named as a MIT 35 innovator. 35 innovators under 35. I'm always inspired, I think, by what the alumni do, and they're very diverse career paths.
Sweet. I mean, and what is that kind of feeling to you, knowing that they came out of a program that you've built out?
So I think one thing I want to caution, because I think that a challenge of many organizations, many incubators and accelerators, and other training organizations will take credit for all of the success of, first and foremost, these people's success is because of their own hard work and determination. So I don't want to be the person taking credit for their success, because that I don't think is fair.
Right. No, that's totally fair. I agree with that.
What I would say though is, what I'm happy is I think that Venture for Canada has hopefully played a role in supporting the acceleration of these people's careers. That hopefully as they reflect on their experiences, and most of our alumni share this, that they can accelerate their impact and accelerate what they can create through participating in Venture for Canada's program. And so it's a positive feedback that we receive from our alumni that certainly motivates me to keep on doing what I do, and makes me really uh, excited, I think, for the potential of what we can accomplish in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that brings me up to our next point, right? So the Canadian ecosystem, the tech ecosystem specifically, has grown a lot significantly, especially within the last, I say, 5 to 6 years. And many of us, or at least people in the South, are calling us the Silicon Valley of the North. Personally, I don't think we're there yet. Just given the size of how many big companies come out of Silicon Valley, and they've had a 20-year kind of head start. But what do you kind of see as challenges in the current ecosystem for Canadian tech companies, and what are kind of the gaps that exist between us and Silicon Valley? I know the head start is one thing, but and ignoring just subtle facts as just say US is more capitalistic versus Canada, etc.
So I actually wrote an opinion piece for the Globe and Mail around 2 years ago on this topic, and one thing that I said is that Canada shouldn't compare itself to Silicon Valley.
Right.
So one of the things I think that's actually really important is I really strongly dislike the term Silicon Valley North, because you're never going to recreate Silicon Valley. In the sense that Silicon Valley is a unique startup ecosystem. Nobody is going to recreate Silicon Valley. And it reaffirmed, I recently read this book by Brad Feld called The Startup Community Way. And one of the things he talks about is that same thing, is that all over the world, he hears people say, we want to be the next Silicon Valley. And that's what he says is, don't try to replicate Silicon Valley, because it's a unique, if you try to become an imitate, it's like if you build an imitation Eiffel Tower in your town, then you're just a cheesy,
Las Vegas.
Yeah, you're cheesy Las Vegas, right? Go try to build your own unique thing that makes it special and takes advantage. The second thing is that Silicon Valley actually has a lot of problems with it. Huge inequality, cost of living.
Yeah.
Look at, I would say a lot of people don't want to even live in Silicon Valley. Coronavirus, there's so many people leaving Silicon Valley.
Right.
So that's more of a challenge on the question. With regards to the broader point about building, Canada's potential to be, I'd say, a technology powerhouse, is that since I've started doing Venture for Canada 6 or 7 years ago, the Canadian technology ecosystem has developed substantially. So you look at a company like Shopify, which is, I'm not sure if it's still the most valued company in Canada, but it was, and certainly trading places with RBC. It's created $100 billion of enterprise value.
Right.
Huge wealth for Canada and Canadians, that I think is something that is super impressive and that we should all be proud of. But behind Shopify, there are many other companies that have done incredibly well over the last 5 years. You look at Lightspeed, POS, in Montreal, gone public, New York Stock Exchange, growing extremely fast. And also a company that 5 or 6 years ago was substantially smaller.
Mm-hmm.
You look at it, Nuvei, a Montreal-based company, recently went public, has done super well, and I think is now, as a valuation, I think was over $5 billion.
Yeah.
You look at, I'd say there's a lot of companies that are growing and have the potential to become large public companies. You look in Kitchener-Waterloo, Applied Board, in 4 years has grown to 500 people. You look at Clio, very successful legal, I think used by 150,000 lawyers now, very successful technology company. You look at a company called Verifin in St. John's, Newfoundland. It's a financial security technology company. It has a valuation reported of over $1 billion. In St. John's. I think we're looking in Canada at a technology ecosystem that has way more mature, large 5 years ago, really, or 6 years ago, that the large anchor tech companies in Canada were really BlackBerry and OpenText and Constellation Software. All those companies still exist in Canada, but now we have a whole new crew of successful anchor companies. And one of the things that's most important, and I'm kind of paraphrasing Brad Feld in this, is you need to build a successful startup ecosystem. You need to have a few breakaway successful companies. Yep. So not a company that sells for 10 or $20 million. You need a few companies that can achieve like $1 billion valuation. Right. You need to have home run companies. Yeah. Because what those home run companies do is it sends a message to local entrepreneurs in the community that they can build $1 billion company. Like to the self-efficacy point earlier, right? If you see somebody has that kind of success in your community, it inspires you to achieve that success. If no one in your community has ever achieved that, then it's that much harder to view yourself as successful or having that potential. Mm-hmm. The other point is that when you build a company that is that successful, or when a company of that level emerges from a place, it has positive knock-on effects on the broader startup ecosystem. And it does through a few ways. One is that the early employees and some of the not so early employees who work at that company, once that company goes public, become very rich. Yep. And have the potential to become angel investors that then completely supercharge the broader ecosystem. Right. Two is that the best accelerator of human talent for startups is actually working for a scale-up company. Mm-hmm. Like Shopify will spawn more entrepreneurs in the sense of the people who work in Shopify, they gain valuable skills and they end up going to create their own company. Chris Grouchy, for instance, the conventional, he worked at Shopify at the beginning of his career. So he, I think he's an example of, and many other people will leave Shopify to go on to create really successful companies. Yep. The third point about how big Shopify companies accelerate the Canadian tech ecosystem is that they, it creates both angel investment, it helps in terms of being kind of an entrepreneurial accelerator, but it also can sometimes help foster a broader ecosystem around that kind of company. So I'll give an example is that one thing I have observed is that the amount of Shopify app developers, yep. Or you look at a company, one of the most successful tech companies in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, is a company called Bold Commerce.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that right after you were talking about this, but you beat me to it.
And there's a whole, I think it's different, but Clearbank, for instance, right? I just saw Clearbank and Shopify, announced a big partnership around inventory financing. Yeah. And, Canada, I would say, I've been reflecting on this recently, is like, we are probably one of the world leaders in e-commerce in the sense of really successful companies that are e-commerce that are based in this country in terms of the tech behind e-commerce. So anyway, the point being is I don't think that we will never be Silicon Valley. We should not aspire to be Silicon Valley. We should aspire to be a leading global center of technology excellence and innovation excellence. I think that we have a lot of ways to go, but I think in the last 5 years, Canada as a country has made huge strides in building those successful multi-billion-dollar anchor companies, which are integral for us to get to the next level, right? It's not about Canada's tech ecosystem will not develop through developing $1,000 million companies. It's about developing $20 billion companies. And that's how I think that and in essence, what we need is, another 10 light speeds. And right. Then the impact that could have in Canada is phenomenal.
For sure. Yeah. And I like that you touched on the kind of like the tech atmosphere and kind of the shifts that we're seeing, because that's kind of where I wanted to go with that on the next point. And this is something that you've touched on as well in terms of the idea of a fourth industrial revolution with AI and automation. And it's changing the landscape of how we work. Whether that was amplified because of COVID, the trend was headed there. So that's where I want to kind of ask you on what you see for the future of work. Especially when you're training these young entrepreneurs along this program, like what kind of jobs do you think will survive this revolution?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I was reading about just this morning. So the I'll start first with the jobs that I think will be destroyed. The jobs that will be destroyed are ones with highly automatable, repeatable tasks.
Right.
So jobs where you know working in a lot of manual factory type environments, those are the jobs. Being a trucker, being a receptionist, those are jobs that are going to get automated away. The jobs that will remain are jobs that are highly focused on human skills. And I would argue entrepreneurial skills. But it would be more than that. One of the things that Business Higher Education Roundtable sometimes uses this term is that the future of work is around like cyborg workers. So workers that combine both technical skills that are relevant and human skills. So I think that a lot of the jobs that will exist in the future will still require technical skills,
Right.
but it's going to be a marriage of technical and human skills that are going to be the most important. So some of the jobs that are going to be most in demand, I think, are salespeople, customer success, software engineers, scrum masters. Those are kind of jobs that are going to boom in the short term. AI, scientists, data scientists,
Right.
and yeah, we're going to, in the next 20 years, we're going to see more jobs cease to exist and more new jobs come into play than we probably have, in the history of humanity.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's kind of the trend that we're heading towards, and you touched on a lot of those kind of the industries that are impacted right now. So it's refreshing to see a program like yours where it's preparing the youth for that change, because historically it's pretty evident that like we tend not to anticipate those changes, and we're always one step behind. So it's good to have programs like that in place. So on that note, that's kind of like the bulk of the conversation that we wanted to cover in terms of what you're doing with your company. What we want to pivot into right now is a little lighter segment where Aman's going to take over with some quick fire questions for you. We call it the lightning round, and he's just going to bombard you with some 5 questions here with maybe 5 to 10 seconds for you to answer this.
Awesome.
Sweet. So let's go for the first question here. Favorite book of all time? I know you've been talking about a lot of books you've been reading. So which one's your favorite though?
The Power Broker by Robert Caro.
Sweet, sweet. How do you unwind after a long day?
Yoga or running?
Sweet. Exercise and just staying, that breathing stuff does work a lot. If you had one person you can have dinner with, who would it be?
Barack Obama.
I like it.
I think that's a third person that said that, third guest that's had that answer. So welcome to that club. A company that excites you the most right now?
Shopify.
Sweet. And this is probably one of the most controversial questions we have on our podcast, but pineapple on pizza, nay or yay?
Nay.
Okay, see,
Nay, okay, all right.
we've been getting a lot of nays recently, so I'm team nay, by the way, and Sherston's team yay.
The demographics are changing. I was winning this whole time, but apparently people don't like pineapples anymore.
Just not on pizza.
Yeah, yeah. By itself, it's okay. By itself, it's okay. But yeah, man, Scott, I really appreciate you coming on. This was a wonderful conversation. Really got to know more about what you're up to and building great things with Venture for Canada. There's a lot of obviously interesting alumni doing great things. And that's a testament to obviously learning from the program, but also working hard for themselves. And obviously, just your thoughts on the Canadian ecosystem as it's growing. So again, thank you so much for being a part of this.
Awesome. Thank you, Aman and Sherston. And have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And I appreciate the invitation to be on the show.